Hello, class. Welcome to Chapter 7, which is all about hiring and promotion decisions. You know, there are some good legal topics in this chapter that I want to point out to you. But a chapter like this is, for the most part, kind of more on the traditional human resources side of, like a recruiting department or an employment kind of group. So again, I'm not going to focus as much of the details as the textbook does, but there are a couple of very key points that I want you to know for Chapter 7. The first is, and you may have heard these four letters before, BFOQ. BFOQ stands for bona fide occupational qualification. So this is a very important legal topic about, kind of when can you use certain discretion within your hiring. So about, who you specifically want to target. Because, for most of our employment decisions, we're making decisions without regard to race, religion, age, sex, gender, sexual orientation, things along those lines. But there are, like anything else, there's exception to the rules. And if you are going to use one of those characteristics as a reason for hiring somebody, the reason behind it has to be what we call BFOQ, or it has to be a bona fide occupational qualification. And here's what I mean by that. And your book does a good job of kind of talking about the three types specifically, and I'll discuss those. First off is one that they call authenticity. So, and this is usually, as it sounds, to make something more authentic. The best example is, let's say you're hiring for actors or actresses for a movie. So let's say that you're hiring a role and the role requires a woman to be in this role. So as part of, the authentic story that you're telling. So, being able to only hire a woman for that role makes sense because, again, you want to be authentic with that role. So, in a case like, you have to hire for, specifically like a role, for a movie, whether that's a certain race, a certain gender, those are generally okay as long as it's in a setting such as that. The second reason would be for things like public safety. And you can, in the main example I can think of with this is usually for prisons. So for a lot, especially for, let's say, a male maximum security prison, for true safety purposes, it makes sense to only hire men to work at a highly, especially, when they're physically handling prisoners. Generally a lot of prisons will make that, a male only requirement because, again, of the physical aspect and the public safety aspect of dealing with, violent offenders. Kind of the same thing with women working in women's prisons. So that's kind of the main argument behind having a public safety aspect. And then the third one is for privacy concerns, and you see that a lot in like psychological therapy groups or things like that, or like on-call wards of certain hospitals where it's required that you need to give out on who could come in. You need to have at least one male staff person on staff and a female person to be able to handle, whoever comes in. So, just to handle for privacy concerns and be able to discuss certain privacy aspects. So, again, those are three limited areas where a BFOQ, bona fide occupational qualification, would come into play. So make sure you understand that aspect of a BFOQ very, very closely. And closely related to that is this idea behind affirmative action, so that your book discusses. Now, for our purposes in this class, when we talk about affirmative action, we talk about the affirmative action plans that the U.S. government, for certain government contracts, requires us to create an affirmative action plan for the company or the organization. I'm not so much talking about the admission side of things, which is a whole separate, like college admissions. That's something separate. But for our purposes, we talk about affirmative action. We talk about the goal of increasing the diversity, the equity, and inclusion of a workplace. And again, your book does kind of discuss a little bit about, the ideas behind affirmative action, what it is, what it's designed to do. So really what I want you to know is make sure you understand the basic idea behind affirmative action, why the government encourages it, why, so many places have affirmative action plans, and what it means specifically. So, AAP plans are not quotas. Quotas are generally, for the most part, illegal. illegal, where you say, well, I need to hire 3 people. I'm only going to hire 3 women, or I'm only going to hire 3 Asian Americans. And even if your goals are good, you're wanting to increase diversity of your workplace. You want to increase, bring in people from all kinds of different aspects of life. It's a very noble goal. But again, saying, well, I'm only going to consider women for this role. I'm only going to consider people of color for this role. Again, absent a BFOQ that we just discussed, generally quotas are illegal. So in place of quotas, we have affirmative action plans. So make sure you understand what goes into an affirmative action plan. Your book does a good job of discussing this idea behind weight and appearance, and there is, and again, I'm not going to dive into too much detail because so much of weight and appearance is state specific. Some states have rules on weight and appearance guidelines, others do not, about, how much can you determine somebody's weight and or appearance in your hiring decisions. I think probably the most obvious example that you've probably seen out there is the idea of Hooters waitresses. What criteria can Hooters utilize to hire servers, food servers, in with the uniform that is required to be worn, and their expectations on how they view weight and appearance. So again, I'm not. That's probably the most obvious example that you probably see out there. So make sure you do a good job of reading the section about weight and appearance, when it can be used, when it cannot be used, and kind of the details that go on that. So again, it's hard to kind of talk about because it is so state specific, because some states have more protections in this area than others, and there's really no federal guidelines on weight and appearance, at least it's in a very limited capacity. But again, make sure you generally understand the overall idea behind weight and appearance. There is a section in Chapter 7 about interviews, acceptances, and promotions. I'm not really concerned that you know too much about that because that's more basic human resources stuff. They do discuss a little bit of the legality behind interviewing, accepting, and promotion, but most of that you probably have already knew about before even coming into this class. So I don't really expect you to know too much about that. There won't be a test question on that. So, but again, that's that idea behind interviews, acceptance, and promotion. Read through it, but again, you won't be tested on that. But there is the one final point about this chapter that I do want you to know about is the glass ceiling. So, glass ceiling is one of those concepts that's really prevalent, unfortunately in our workplace about, for a lot of different groups, especially, traditionally marginalized groups, this idea about how far you can go until you hit kind of this ceiling, glass ceiling where you can't go any further. You can see up, but you can't really go any further, and a lot of this gets, really exacerbated, especially with more traditional, you've probably heard all those, statistics. They say that women make 80% of what men do, or maybe sometimes even lower, where women over the last 20 or 30 years have really made large strides in being promoted in organizations, but still at those very highest levels, those vice president and president roles, those are still predominantly dominated by men. So women would be victims of this glass ceiling, but able to get into an organization, but how high can they really go before traditionally they've been unable to get higher in that. So there are some legalities behind the glass ceiling, so make sure that's kind of the last section of this chapter. Make sure you read that very thoroughly and understand about the glass ceiling. So, all right, well, those are all the details for Chapter 7, and I will see you soon for Chapter 8.